Before sunrise in Burkina Faso, a farmer walks between rows of crops and studies the soil beneath his boots. He is not thinking about Washington. He is thinking about water, fertilizer, the next harvest, and whether the price he receives will justify another season of work. Yet, thousands of miles away, trade rules can change the value of what people like him produce. In February 2026, the United States introduced a temporary 10% import surcharge covering many goods entering the country. It was not a tariff designed specifically for Burkina Faso, and that distinction mattered. But for a small economy watching global markets become less predictable, the message was impossible to ignore. Access to foreign buyers can change because of decisions you do not control. If Burkina Faso economic future matters to you, press like and tell us where you are watching from, because this story is not really about 10%. It is about the choices a nation makes when the outside world becomes harder to predict. Ibrahim Traore and his government face a question that many African leaders have faced for generations. Should Burkina Faso spend its energy reacting every time a major power changes the rules, or should it accelerate investment in the things it can influence directly? Land, water, seeds, machinery, storage, processing, roads, regional trade. For the farmer standing in that field, economic sovereignty is not an abstract slogan. It is whether his crop survives, whether someone buys it, whether his family earns enough, and whether more of the value created by his labor remains close to home. And that is where the tariff shock becomes something much larger, because Burkina Faso's deepest economic vulnerability did not begin in Washington. The 10% shock merely exposed a problem that had been there for decades. The deeper problem facing Burkina Faso was never created by one American tariff. It was built over years through a familiar economic pattern seen across much of Africa. Countries produce raw agricultural value, but too much of the processing, packaging, branding, financing, and distribution happens somewhere else. Consider something as simple as a mango. A farmer grows it in Burkina Faso. He clears the land, finds water, protects the crop, waits through the season, and accepts the risk of weather and disease. Yet once that mango leaves the farm, its economic life is only beginning. It can be cleaned, sorted, dried, processed into juice, packaged, branded, transported, marketed, and sold at a much higher final value. Every one of those steps creates income. Everyone creates jobs. Everyone adds another layer of profit. The critical question is how many of those layers remain inside Burkina Faso. This is why the tariff shock matters less as a direct punishment and more as a warning. When a country depends heavily on decisions, buyers, and processing systems beyond its control, even a small change in global trade conditions can reveal how narrow its room to maneuver really is. Burkina Faso's own agricultural strategy had already begun addressing that vulnerability. Under the 2023 to 2025 offensive agro-pastorale et halieutique, the country identified 8 strategic value chains, including rice, maize, potatoes, wheat, fish, livestock, poultry, and mangoes, with the stated objective of strengthening food sovereignty, increasing domestic production, and reducing dependence on imports. But there is an important difference between announcing a target and transforming an economy. Plans are not harvests, targets are not results. A farmer does not become more secure because a document uses the word sovereignty. He becomes more secure when irrigation reaches his field, when machinery works, when he needs it, when fertilizer and seed remain affordable, when roads remain open, when storage is available, and when a buyer offers a price that makes the next season worth planting. Imagine a farmer outside a regional market after a strong harvest. His problem is no longer whether he can produce enough. His problem is time. Fresh crops lose value quickly. If storage is limited and processing capacity is far away, he may have to sell when prices are weakest. The harvest can be good and the income can still disappoint. That is one of the hidden weaknesses inside agricultural economies. Success in the field does not automatically become prosperity at home. And this is where Burkina Faso's challenge becomes much larger than farming. Water infrastructure matters. Warehouses matter. Electricity matters. Cold storage matters. Milling matters. Packaging matters. Reliable transportation matters. Financing matters. Quality standards matter. Security along trade routes matters. Agriculture, in other words, starts to look less like a rural policy and more like the foundation of an industrial strategy. That shift changes the entire story. Instead of asking only how Burkina Faso can grow more rice, maize, wheat, livestock, or mangoes, the government must ask how much value can be created after the harvest. Instead of measuring success only in tons produced, it must eventually measure jobs created, food processed locally, imports replaced where economically sensible, businesses formed, regional contracts signed, and household incomes improved. If this economic story were a chessboard, what would you move first? Production, processing, or trade? Because each choice carries a different risk. Expand production too quickly without storage, and farmers can face collapsing prices. Build factories without reliable supply, and machinery can sit idle. Open new trade routes without competitive products, and imported goods can still dominate the shelves. That is why the transformation now associated with Ibrahim Traore is more complicated than slogans about independence. Burkina Faso is attempting to connect the farm to the warehouse to the factory to the road, and the road to the market. If that chain holds, agriculture can become more than food security. It can become employment policy, industrial policy, trade policy, and national resilience at the same time. But growing more is still only the first victory. The harder question is whether Burkina Faso can stop watching so much of the value leave after the harvest leaves the field. This is where Burkina Faso's story begins to change. The first two parts of this journey were about vulnerability, changing trade rules abroad, limited processing at home, and the uncomfortable reality that producing a crop does not guarantee that a nation keeps most of its value. But under Ibrahim Traore, agriculture has increasingly been framed not simply as a rural necessity, but as a strategic pillar of national resilience. That shift is important because food security is never only about food. It is about whether a country can protect families when global prices move. It is about whether young men and women can find productive work without leaving their communities. It is about whether a bad harvest becomes a local hardship or a national emergency. And it is about whether a government can create more room to make its own economic decisions. In that sense, Burkina Faso's agricultural push is a gamble, but not because farming itself is new. The gamble is whether the country can connect production, infrastructure, processing, and markets quickly enough to create a different economic structure. Picture a farmer standing beside an irrigation channel early in the morning. For years, his most important calculation may have been the sky. Will the rains arrive? Will they last? Will one dry period destroy months of labor? Irrigation changes that calculation. It does not eliminate risk, but it gives the farmer something critically important: greater control over time. A working water system can mean another planting cycle. It can mean more predictable yields. It can mean the difference between waiting for nature and planning production. That is why irrigation projects matter far beyond the concrete channels and pumps visible from the road. They represent a transfer of uncertainty into productive capacity. Burkina Faso has also pushed agricultural mechanization and the expansion of cultivated areas as part of its food sovereignty agenda. But machines by themselves are not a revolution. A tractor is useful only if farmers can access it, maintain it, fuel it, and integrate it into a system that eventually pays for itself. Equipment that cannot be repaired becomes a monument. Infrastructure that cannot be maintained becomes a promise frozen in concrete. That is why the real test of Ibrahim Traore's agricultural strategy will not be how many machines appear at public ceremonies. It will be how many productive seasons those machines support after the cameras leave. Now imagine a second character in this story. He is younger than the farmer we met earlier. Perhaps his father thinks about agriculture in terms of planting and harvest. The son sees something else. He sees rice milling. He sees cold storage. He sees packaging. He sees transportation. He sees repair businesses, irrigation services, food distribution, digital marketplaces, and local manufacturing. To him, agriculture does not have to mean returning to the past. It can mean entering an industry that Africa has not fully captured for itself. That generational change may become one of the most important outcomes of Burkina Faso's agricultural strategy. A young population cannot build its future only by producing more raw material. It needs businesses around that production. It needs engineers maintaining equipment. It needs technicians working on pumps. It needs drivers moving goods. It needs processors, accountants, warehouse managers, buyers, mechanics, retailers, and entrepreneurs. One successful agricultural value chain can support dozens of economic roles beyond the farm. That is where national pride becomes more than emotion. It becomes measurable in jobs, income, skills, and productive capacity. But pride must remain connected to reality. Burkina Faso faces serious constraints. Security conditions can disrupt farming and trade. Inputs can become expensive. Water systems require constant maintenance. Machinery needs spare parts. Electricity remains essential for processing. Farmers need access to financing without being buried by costs they cannot repay. Roads have to connect productive zones to markets, and every project must survive the difficult transition from political announcement to daily operation. These are not minor obstacles. They are the difference between transformation and disappointment. That is why the most credible version of Burkina Faso's rise is not a story in which Ibrahim Traore simply announces victory. It is a story in which the government takes a difficult bet, invest in productive capacity today, and hope that farmers, businesses, workers, and markets can turn that investment into lasting economic strength tomorrow. If outside pressure rises again, what should Burkina Faso control first? Its imports, its exports, its farms, its factories? Perhaps the deeper answer is that sovereignty does not come from controlling one thing. It comes from strengthening the chain that connects them all. A farmer grows the crop, a warehouse protects it, a processor adds value, a truck moves it, a business sells it, a family earns from it, a country taxes part of that activity and reinvests. Then the cycle begins again. When that chain becomes stronger, the meaning of a tariff shock changes. It becomes less frightening because the country has more options. That does not mean Burkina Faso can isolate itself from the world, nor should it try. The stronger strategy is diversified capacity, more African trade, and more freedom to negotiate with external partners instead of depending too heavily on any single market. And this is where the emotional center of the story begins to rise. For generations, African nations have often been described through what they lack: capital, infrastructure, technology, processing capacity, access to markets. Burkina Faso is now trying to write a different sentence, one built around what can be constructed step by step. Water brought to the field, machines put to productive use, young people finding businesses around agriculture, farmers gaining more control over timing and output, local companies keeping more value inside the economy. None of that guarantees success, but it changes the direction of the question. For the first time in this story, the question is no longer simply what Burkina Faso might lose when rules change abroad. It is what Burkina Faso could still build with the resources, labor, ambition, and markets closer to home. And if that transformation is going to become real, the next battle will not happen in the field at all. It will begin the moment the harvest leaves it. The next phase of Burkina Faso's transformation begins after the harvest, because this is where an agricultural economy either keeps creating value or starts giving it away. Growing more food can strengthen national resilience, but processing that food can change the structure of an economy. A sack of rice has one value when it leaves the field. Cleaned rice has another. Milled rice has another. Packaged rice has another. Branded rice placed on a supermarket shelf has another still. The same principle applies to maize, mangoes, livestock, poultry, and other products moving through Burkina Faso's agricultural system. Every additional step creates another opportunity for wages, businesses, technical skills, transportation, taxation, and investment. And that is why the most important economic question facing Ibrahim Traore may not be how much Burkina Faso can grow. It may be how much value Burkina Faso can keep before what it grows leaves its hands. Imagine a farmer bringing maize to a local collection point. His work ends when he unloads the crop, but the economic story should not end there. A warehouse worker receives it. A technician checks the machinery. A processor turns it into a product with a longer shelf life. Another worker packages it. A driver moves it toward a town or border market. A retailer sells it. An accountant records the transaction. A mechanic keeps the truck moving. One harvest has now supported an entire chain of activity. That is the difference between agriculture as subsistence and agriculture as an economic platform. Burkina Faso's challenge is to make more of those links operate inside the country. In March 2026, the World Bank approved a roughly $215 $9 million project focused on agricultural transformation in Burkina Faso, with goals that included improving productivity, modernizing processing infrastructure, and strengthening access to markets. That detail matters for another reason. It complicates the easy story that economic sovereignty means turning away from every outside institution. It does not have to mean that at all. A country can seek greater autonomy while still accepting foreign capital, technology, or development partnerships when those partnerships strengthen domestic capacity. The real question is who gains productive power when the project is finished. If outside financing helps build facilities that Burkinabe farmers use, businesses operate, workers maintain, and local markets depend upon, then the partnership may increase sovereignty rather than weaken it. That distinction is critical. Sovereignty is not isolation. It is the ability to negotiate without desperation. It is having more than one option when circumstances change. It is being able to say yes because the terms make sense, not because there is no alternative. But building local processing is harder than announcing it. Factories need electricity that remains reliable. Machines need spare parts. Managers need trained workers. Businesses need credit. Food processors need predictable quantities of raw material. Products need packaging that protects quality. Standards need enforcement if goods are going to compete across borders. And perhaps most importantly, consumers need a reason to buy what those factories produce. A local label is not enough if the price is too high or the quality too low. This is where the romantic version of industrialization meets the hard discipline of economics. Burkina Faso cannot simply declare that more value will stay at home. It must build companies capable of earning that value. That means productivity, reliability, cost control, distribution, trust. It also means accepting that some businesses will succeed and others will fail. Economic transformation is never a straight road. Yet the potential reward is significant. Consider the mango again. If it is exported raw, Burkina Faso earns from the fruit. If it is dried locally, bottled as juice, packaged for retail, or turned into another finished product, the country may capture more labor, more expertise, more business activity, and more margin before that product reaches a distant customer. The same logic becomes even more powerful when applied across several agricultural sectors at once. Rice milling can support food security. Maize processing can support both households and commercial food production. Livestock processing can increase the value retained from animals already raised inside the country. Cold storage can reduce losses before products reach consumers. Warehousing can give farmers more flexibility over when they sell. Logistics companies can connect rural production with urban demand. In that system, the farm becomes the beginning of a network rather than the end of a transaction. This is also where young Burkinabe entrepreneurs could become central to the story. The opportunity is not only to own land, it is to solve the problems surrounding the land. A young engineer can build irrigation services. A technician can maintain pumps. A small company can package food. Another can manage transport. Another can create cold storage. Another can connect buyers and producers. Agriculture then becomes a platform for businesses that did not exist before. That is a much deeper form of economic transformation than simply increasing the number of tons harvested each year, and it carries an emotional meaning as well. For many African countries, the painful part of the old model was not only exporting raw commodities, it was watching the highest value stages of production happen somewhere else. The raw material left, the finished product returned, the jobs were created elsewhere. The branding happened elsewhere. The larger margins accumulated elsewhere. Changing that pattern does not require anger. It requires capability. A processor that runs every day is more powerful than a speech about processing. A warehouse that reduces crop losses is more powerful than a slogan about food independence. A factory that survives without permanent subsidy is more powerful than a ribbon-cutting ceremony. This is where Burkina Faso's national pride must become disciplined. The country does not need applause for attempting industrialization. It needs systems that work after the applause ends. If the lights stay on, if the machines remain productive, if farmers are paid reliably, and if consumers continue buying the products, then something deeper begins to happen. Value stays longer, skills accumulate, businesses learn, workers gain experience, tax revenue grows, suppliers appear, competitors improve, and slowly the country becomes harder to push around because it has more productive options at home. That may be the real significance of Ibrahim Traore's economic gamble. He is not simply betting on agriculture. He is betting that Burkina Faso can connect agriculture to industry. If that connection works, a tariff shock abroad becomes less dangerous because the country is no longer depending only on the first and weakest step of the value chain. It can sell food. It can sell processed food. It can sell services around that production. It can build domestic demand. It can negotiate for foreign markets from a stronger position, but as a successful factory, eventually faces the same unavoidable question. Once Burkina Faso learns how to produce more and keep more value at home, who is going to buy everything it makes? Once Burkina Faso begin producing more and processing more, the next question becomes unavoidable. Where does the next customer come from? The obvious answer is to look toward the same wealthy markets that Africa exporters have chased for decades: Europe, North America, Asia. Those markets still matter, and Burkina Faso would gain little by pretending otherwise. But the tariff shock reveals another possibility. Perhaps the strongest long-term response to external trade uncertainty is not to replace one distant market with another. Perhaps it is to build more demand closer to home. That idea changes the map. Burkina Faso is landlocked, but it is not economically isolated. It sits inside West Africa, surrounded by countries with growing cities, expanding populations, rising food demand, and their own pressure to improve food security. That means a bag of processed rice, a carton of dried mangoes, a livestock product, or a packaged maize product does not always need to cross an ocean to find value. It may need to cross a border. This is where the logic of African regional trade becomes more important. If Burkina Faso can improve production, processing, quality, storage, and transport at the same time, the country can begin thinking beyond import substitution and toward competitive regional sales. That is a much more ambitious goal. Import substitution asks whether Burkina Faso can replace something it currently buys from abroad. Regional competitiveness asks whether a Burkinabe company can make something good enough, reliable enough, and affordable enough that consumers in neighboring countries choose to buy it. Those are very different tests. The first is defensive. The second is offensive. And the second is where real economic power begins to grow. Imagine a truck leaving a processing facility in Burkina Faso. It is carrying a finished food product rather than an unprocessed crop. That one distinction is almost everything. More labor has already been paid before the truck reaches the border. More technical knowledge has already been used. More packaging, storage, accounting, and logistics have already happened inside Burkina Faso. If that product reaches a buyer elsewhere in West Africa, the country is no longer participating only as a supplier of raw material. It is competing as a producer of finished value. That is why continental trade frameworks such as the African Continental Free Trade Area matter strategically. Even though agreements alone cannot create commerce, a trade agreement can reduce barriers, but it cannot repair a road. It cannot keep a refrigeration system running. It cannot guarantee that a shipment arrives on time. It cannot force a customer to trust the quality of a product. The real work still happens in warehouses, factories, checkpoints, transport companies, laboratories, farms, banks, and marketplaces. If this is where Africa's next economic map is being drawn, then it may be drawn less by speeches than by trucks that actually move, warehouses that actually protect crops, and buyers who actually pay. Which part of that chain would you strengthen first? The African perspective becomes especially important here because different people will judge Burkina Faso's experiment by very different standards. A farmer may not care whether economists call the policy sovereign or strategic. He wants to know whether a larger market means a better and more reliable price. A young entrepreneur may see the same policy and ask where the missing business opportunity is. Can she build a packaging company? Can she organize transport? Can she process fruit? Can she provide cold storage? Can she connect farmers with urban buyers? A neighboring government may ask a different question entirely. If Burkina Faso can turn domestic agricultural investment into regional trade, can we do the same? That is how one national experiment can begin to matter beyond national borders. Not because every African country will copy Burkina Faso, and not because every government will agree with Ibrahim Traore, they will not. But governments across the continent are watching the same pressures: food prices, unemployment, foreign exchange constraints, infrastructure gaps, and the political danger of depending too heavily on systems they cannot fully control. Burkina Faso therefore becomes interesting as a test. Can a country under serious security and financial constraints still build enough agricultural capacity to strengthen its negotiating position? Can it move beyond simply producing more crops and begin capturing more processing and commercial value? Can regional demand become a meaningful second pillar alongside trade with Europe, America, and Asia? And economic nationalism be converted into competitive companies rather than permanent protection from competition? These questions matter far more than slogans. They also create a difficult truth for Ibrahim Traore. If he wants Burkina Faso to trade more across Africa, the country cannot rely only on patriotic buying. A customer in another country will not pay more simply because the product came from Burkina Faso. The product has to compete, it has to arrive, it has to meet standards, it has to be priced sensibly, it has to earn trust. That means the same government that talks about sovereignty also has to create conditions for discipline, efficiency, and accountability. In that sense, regional trade may become the strongest test of the agricultural project. Domestic policy can protect an industry for a period. A competitive regional market eventually exposes whether that industry is genuinely strong. But if Burkina Faso succeeds, the emotional meaning could be much larger than one export contract. It would offer a different image of African economic cooperation. A farmer in one African country producing for a processor at home, a company adding value locally, a truck crossing an African border, a consumer in another African country buying the finished product, money circulating through more African hands before leaving the continent, if it leaves at all. That is not isolation from the world, it is diversification within it. And that distinction matters. The goal should not be to shut out Europe, America, China, or any other external partner. The stronger goal is to make sure Burkina Faso has enough productive capacity and enough market options that no single outside decision can define its future. That may be the most important lesson of the original tariff shock. When Washington changes a rule, Burkina Faso cannot control Washington. When global demand weakens, Burkina Faso cannot command foreign consumers. When international finance becomes more expensive, Burkina Faso cannot set global interest rates. But it can try to build more irrigation. It can try to improve storage. It can try to train workers. It can try to support processing. It can try to reduce unnecessary losses. It can try to make regional trade easier. It can try to give its businesses more than one road to a customer. Every additional road, literal or economic, reduces the danger of dependence on a single route. That is why the story that began with a 10% American surcharge may end up having very little to do with America. The bigger story is whether Burkina Faso can use uncertainty abroad to accelerate capacity at home and opportunity across Africa. If that happens, other governments will notice. Farmers will notice. Entrepreneurs will notice. Investors will notice. Competitors will notice. And the idea of African economic sovereignty will begin to be judged not by speeches, but by whether goods actually move, businesses survive, workers earn, and families become more secure. But before calling that a breakthrough, Burkina Faso still faces the hardest part of the entire journey, because building sovereignty is one thing. Paying for it, maintaining it, securing it, and proving that it can survive bad harvests, weak markets, security pressure, political disappointment is something else entirely. The hardest part of Burkina Faso's economic transformation begins after the excitement fades, because sovereignty is easy to celebrate in a speech and much harder to maintain through bad harvests, expensive fuel, broken machinery, weak roads, disrupted trade routes, and disappointed expectations. If Ibrahim Traore's agricultural strategy is going to become more than a powerful national message, it will have to survive ordinary reality. Farmers will still face climate risk. Processors will still need reliable electricity. Businesses will still need affordable credit. Trucks will still need safe roads. Warehouses will still need maintenance. Consumers will still compare prices. Regional buyers will still demand quality. And the government will still need outside partners, capital, technology, and markets. This is why the final test of sovereignty is not whether Burkina Faso can separate itself from the world. It is whether Burkina Faso can become strong enough to deal with the world on better terms. That is a much more difficult goal, but it is also a more serious one. A farmer cannot control a decision made in Washington. He cannot control a global price shock. He cannot control whether an international buyer suddenly changes direction. But Burkina Faso can influence whether water reaches his field. It can influence whether his harvest enters storage instead of being sold in desperation. It can influence whether a local processor is able to buy what he produces. It can influence whether a road connects that processor to another African market. It can influence whether a young technician is trained to repair the equipment that keeps the system alive. That is the difference between dependency and resilience. Dependency means waiting for the outside world to remain favorable. Resilience means building enough internal strength that unfavorable conditions do not become national paralysis. And this is where the story returns to the farmer we met at the beginning. At first, he stood in a field thinking about rain price and another season. Somewhere far away, the rules of trade changed. He had no voice in that decision. But if Burkina Faso succeeds in building stronger irrigation, better storage, more local processing, stronger logistics, and broader African markets, then the next time the outside world changes a rule, his future may depend a little less on someone else's decision. That does not mean the country has won. It means the country may have more options, and options are the beginning of bargaining power. This is where Ibrahim Traore's legacy will eventually be judged, not by the number of speeches that inspire applause, not by the number of ceremonies that produce dramatic images, not by the number of slogans about sovereignty. The harder measure will be production, income, jobs, competitive businesses, reliable infrastructure, farmers who can plan further ahead, young people who see opportunity in agriculture without seeing poverty, processes that survive after subsidies fade, products that can cross borders because buyers trust them, families that become more secure, because the national economy keeps more value before it sends goods abroad. If those things happen, then Burkina Faso's agricultural pivot will represent something much larger than a response to a temporary tariff shock. It will represent a change in economic posture. The country will not be saying that it no longer needs the world. It will be saying that it wants to meet the world with more of its own productive strength behind it. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning of African economic pride. Pride is not pretending that every problem has been solved. Pride is looking directly at the weaknesses, deciding they are not permanent, and building institutions capable of outlasting one leader, one policy, one harvest, or one crisis. The real victory would not be that Burkina Faso became independent of every outside power. No modern economy can do that. The real victory would be that no single outside power, market, institution, or tariff could easily determine Burkina Faso's economic direction. That is a far more ambitious form of sovereignty. It is slower. It is less dramatic. It requires discipline. But if it works, it can survive long after the headlines disappear. So perhaps the most important question is not whether Burkina Faso can grow enough food this year. It is whether the country can build a system strong enough that the farmer's work creates value through the field, the warehouse, the factory, the truck, the market, and finally the household. The true measure of sovereignty may be surprisingly simple. When a Burkinabe farmer finishes a harvest, how much of the value created by his hands remains within reach of his family, his community, and his country. Now I want your judgment. Should Burkina Faso hold its present course or pivot even faster toward agriculture, local processing, and African trade? Write your answer below and explain why. If you believe Africa's economic transformation deserves serious attention, like this video, share it with someone who follows Burkina Faso, and subscribe for the next report. because the tariff shock that opened this story may eventually be remembered as nothing more than another temporary disruption, or it may be remembered as the moment Burkina Faso received a warning from the outside world and decided to build more strength from within.